The white satin of my wedding dress felt like chains around my chest as I pressed my back against the cold marble pillar of St. Catherine's Cathedral. Through the ornate stained glass windows, afternoon sunlight painted rainbow fragments across the stone floor. But all I could see was the figure in the black suit standing near the altar. The same man who had walked out of my life 3 years ago without explanation, without goodbye, without even taking his coffee mug from my kitchen counter. Marcus Reed. 6 feet 2 inches of quiet intensity, dark hair that always looked like he'd just run his fingers through it, and those steel gray eyes that once knew every secret I'd ever whispered in the dark. Now he stood like a sentinel among my wedding guests, his posture too rigid, his gaze too alert, scanning faces with the methodical precision of someone trained to spot danger in a crowd of celebration. My fingers found the delicate pearl necklace at my throat, my grandmother's necklace, the one she wore to her own wedding in 1952. The pearls were warm against my skin, worn smooth by decades of nervous touches just like this one. Something old, Mom had said when she fastened it around my neck an hour ago, her eyes bright with tears and secrets I was only now beginning to understand. "Sarah, sweetheart, you look like you've seen a ghost." My maid of honor, Jessica, appeared beside me with a rustle of lavender chiffon. Her auburn curls were perfectly arranged, not a single strand out of place, despite the humidity that had been building all morning. She'd been my roommate in college, my confidant through 3 heartbreaks, my voice of reason when I'd wanted to drop out of law school after Marcus disappeared. Now she studied my face with the concern of someone who'd held my hair back during too many nights of wine and regret. "Worse than a ghost," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the soft murmur of guests finding their seats. "Mom invited Marcus. He's here, Jess. He's actually here at my wedding, and I think he's working security or something. Look at the way he's positioned himself, the way he keeps checking his watch, and that thing in his ear." Jessica's brown eyes widened as she followed my gaze. Marcus had moved to a different position now, closer to the side exit, his hand resting casually at his waist in a way that made my stomach clench with recognition. During our 2 years together, I'd learned to read the subtle signs of his hypervigilance, the way his shoulders would set when he sensed trouble, the careful positioning that always gave him multiple escape routes, the habit of cataloging every person in a room within minutes of entering. "That's definitely not normal wedding guest behavior," Jessica murmured, adjusting her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. "Sarah, what aren't you telling me about why he left? Because right now he looks less like your heartbroken ex and more like someone's personal protection detail." The cathedral's ancient bells began their ceremonial toll, each bronze note reverberating through the stone walls like a countdown to some inevitable collision between my past and present. Before he left, Marcus was a graduate student in criminal psychology writing his thesis on behavioral analysis while bartending at Murphy's pub downtown to pay his bills. He'd been passionate about understanding the criminal mind, fascinated by the patterns that most people missed. But he'd also been warm, funny, capable of making me laugh until my sides ached over terrible movies and takeout Chinese food on Sunday nights. The man standing near my wedding altar bore little resemblance to that younger version of himself. This Marcus moved with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to violence, someone who'd seen too much and learned to carry it quietly. His black suit was expensive, tailored. Nothing like the thrift store blazers he used to wear to faculty dinners. Even from across the cathedral, I could see the slight bulge beneath his left armpit that suggested a shoulder holster. "Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery," my mother's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts like a blade through silk. Patricia Montgomery emerged from behind another marble pillar, her champagne-colored mother-of-the-bride dress flowing around her like liquid elegance. At 62, she was still stunning. Silver hair swept into a perfect chignon, pearl earrings that matched my necklace, and the kind of composed smile that had served her well during 30 years as a federal judge. But her blue eyes, so much like my own, held a weight I'd never seen before.
"Mom, what did you do?" The words came out sharper than I intended, edged with the panic that had been building since I'd spotted Marcus 20 minutes ago. Why is he here? After what he put me through, after how he just vanished without explanation, why would you invite him to my wedding? Patricia's composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked suspiciously like regret mixed with desperate determination. She glanced toward Marcus, who had somehow moved closer without seeming to move at all, and I caught the subtle nod that passed between them, a communication that spoke of prior arrangement, of plans made without my knowledge or consent. Because, darling, there are things you don't understand about why Marcus left, she said quietly, her judge's voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly as she straightened my veil. Things I should have told you 3 years ago, things I've been protecting you from. But I can't protect you anymore, not when... She stopped abruptly, her gaze flicking to something over my shoulder. We're putting a lot of time and effort into bringing you these intense, well-researched stories. If you're enjoying this tale of love, betrayal, and federal operations, please hit that like button, share with friends who love suspense, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. They took positions along the walls with the practiced ease of people accustomed to blending into backgrounds while maintaining optimal sightlines. Mrs. Montgomery, a woman approached us with quiet confidence, her black hair pulled back in a severe bun, her dark suit impeccably tailored. She was perhaps 40, with the kind of lean build that suggested both physical training and discipline. A small gold badge was clipped to her belt, partially hidden by her jacket. "I'm Special Agent Chen, FBI. I need to speak with your daughter immediately." The world seemed to tilt sideways. FBI. The letters hung in the air like smoke, reshaping everything I thought I knew about this day, about my mother's strange behavior, about Marcus's impossible reappearance in my life. Jessica's hand found my elbow, steadying me as Agent Chen continued speaking in low, urgent tones. "Miss Montgomery, there's been a credible threat against your life. We have reason to believe that someone will attempt to harm you today during the ceremony. Agent Reed has been assigned as your primary protection detail." She gestured toward Marcus, who had somehow moved closer without seeming to move at all, and I caught the subtle nod that passed between them, a communication that spoke of prior arrangement, of plans made without my knowledge or consent. Agent Reed volunteered for this assignment. But, Miss Montgomery, I need you to understand, this is not about your past relationship. This is about keeping you alive long enough to testify about what you witnessed. What I witnessed, the words came out as barely more than breath. I don't know anything about Viktor Kozlov. I've never even heard that name before. Agent Chen exchanged a look with my mother that confirmed what I was beginning to suspect, that everyone in my life had been keeping secrets, that the carefully constructed reality I'd been living in was about to crumble completely. "Do you remember the courthouse parking garage that night? Anyone who seemed out of place?" The memory surfaced like a bubble rising from deep water. 3 years ago, October 15th, the night that had changed everything. Mom had been distracted during dinner, checking her phone constantly, talking about a difficult sentencing that was coming up. We'd gone to the courthouse around 10 p.m., the building nearly empty except for security guards and a few night janitors. I'd waited in the car while she ran up to her chambers, but I'd needed to use the restroom, so I'd followed her inside. In the elevator, going up to the 16th floor, I'd noticed a man in maintenance coveralls who'd gotten on at the parking level. He'd had part full of cleaning supplies, but something about him had felt wrong. The expensive watch on his wrist, the way his eyes had tracked every movement I made, the fact that his coveralls were too clean for someone who'd been working all day. "The janitor," I whispered, my hand going instinctively to the pearl necklace. "In the elevator. He wasn't really a janitor, was he?" "Dmitry Volkov, Kozlov's nephew and primary enforcer. He was there to plant surveillance equipment in your mother's chambers. But you saw his face, Ms. Montgomery. You can identify him." That makes you the only living witness who can place him at the courthouse the night before your mother received the anonymous tip that led to Kozlov's arrest. The cathedral was filling up now, late guests hurrying to find seats as the processional music began to swell from the massive pipe organ. My fiancé, David, would be waiting at the altar in his navy blue tuxedo, probably checking his watch and wondering why the ceremony was running late. David, who worked in marketing for a tech company, who played weekend softball and collected vintage vinyl records, who knew nothing about arms dealers and federal investigations and the dangerous secrets that had been swirling around my family for years. "I can't do this," I said, my voice rising slightly above the music. "I can't walk down that aisle knowing that someone wants to kill me, knowing that my ex-boyfriend is here as my bodyguard because my mother has been lying to me about federal cases and Russian criminals. I can't marry David when I don't even know who I am anymore." Jessica's grip on my arm tightened, her brown eyes fierce with protective loyalty. "Sarah, honey, we don't have to do anything you don't want to do. We can call this whole thing off right now if that's what you need." But Agent Chen was shaking her head, her expression urgent. "I'm afraid that's not an option, Ms. Montgomery. If you don't go through with the ceremony, if you break your normal routine, it could trigger an immediate attempt on your life. Kozlov's people are watching, waiting for any sign that you know about the threat. Your safety depends on everything appearing completely normal." Normal. The word tasted bitter on my tongue as I looked out at the cathedral full of guests who had no idea they were attending what might be my funeral instead of my wedding. 300 people who'd come to celebrate love and new beginnings, now unwittingly serving as cover for a federal protection operation. "Agent Reed will be with you every step of the way," Agent Chen added, her voice gentler now. "He's positioned himself to have clear sight lines down the entire aisle and to the altar. Nothing will happen to you while he's watching." Through the crowd, I could see Marcus more clearly now. He had moved again, this time to a position near the front of the cathedral where he could see both the main entrance and the side doors. His gray eyes found mine across the space, and for just a moment I saw a flash of something that looked like the man I used to know. Concern, tenderness, regret. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it, replaced by the cold professionalism of someone whose job was to keep me alive. The wedding march began to play, the familiar melody echoing off the stone walls like a call to destiny. My mother took my arm, her fingers cold against my skin, despite her composed expression. "Sarah, I know this is overwhelming. I know you feel betrayed, and you have every right to be angry with me. But Marcus never stopped loving you. Walking away from you was the hardest thing he ever had to do, and he's been trying to find a way back to you ever since."
"By lying to me for 3 years?" I hissed back, my voice lost in the swelling organ music. "By letting me think I wasn't good enough? That I'd done something wrong? By protecting you from people who would have killed you without hesitation if they'd known what you'd seen?" Patricia's judge voice cut through my anger like a gavel striking wood. "Darling, I've made mistakes, but keeping you safe has never been one of them." The cathedral doors opened to reveal the long aisle stretching toward the altar, white rose petals scattered across burgundy carpet, candles flickering in the growing twilight. David stood at the front, tall and handsome in his navy tuxedo, his face lighting up with joy as he saw me. Behind him, the priest waited with his ceremonial book, ready to perform the sacrament that would bind my life to another's. But my eyes weren't on my groom. They were on Marcus, who had positioned himself along the side wall where he could see everything. Every guest, every exit, every shadow that might hide a threat. He was holding something small in his left hand, speaking quietly into what I now recognized as a wireless communication device. As I began the slow walk down the aisle, my arm linked with my mother's, the weight of my grandmother's pearls against my throat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking not toward my future, but toward answers that would change everything I thought I knew about my past. The storm clouds outside had grown darker, and the first drops of rain were beginning to spatter against the stained glass windows. In 6 hours, this would all be over, one way or another.
But right now, with each step carrying me closer to the altar, closer to David's trusting smile and Marcus's watchful presence, I had no idea whether I was walking toward my wedding or my own funeral. The only thing I knew for certain was that by the time the cathedral bells tolled again, nothing in my life would ever be the same. The memory of yesterday morning felt like it belonged to someone else's life. This morning, I'd been Sarah Montgomery, corporate lawyer specializing in intellectual property disputes, whose biggest worry was whether the florist had delivered enough white peonies for the reception centerpieces. I'd wakened in my downtown apartment to the sound of rain against the windows, stretched languidly in the king-size bed David and I had picked out together last spring, and reached automatically for the phone to check my morning routine. Weather app, news headlines, text messages from the wedding coordinator about final timeline adjustments. My apartment had been a sanctuary then. All clean lines and neutral colors, carefully curated to reflect the successful, organized woman I'd worked so hard to become after Marcus left. The living room showcased my law degree from Georgetown, framed photographs of me arguing cases before federal appeals courts, a bookshelf lined with precedents and case law volumes. Everything in its place, everything under control. I'd stood in my walk-in closet that morning, running my fingers along the plastic-covered wedding dress hanging in the center like a white silk monument to hope and second chances. After Marcus, I'd sworn off love for 2 years. I'd thrown myself into my career, working 70-hour weeks, taking on the most challenging cases, building a reputation as someone who never backed down from a fight. The loneliness had been a constant ache, but it had felt safer than vulnerability. Then David had walked into my life during a coffee shop collision that had left us both wearing half of my vanilla latte. He'd been so different from Marcus, predictable where Marcus had been mysterious, open where Marcus had been guarded, content with simple pleasures where Marcus had always seemed to be looking over his shoulder for something I couldn't see. David talked about his feelings, remembered anniversaries, sent good morning texts that weren't code for deeper complications. "You deserve someone who shows up," Jessica had told me 6 months into the relationship, when David had surprised me with a weekend trip to Napa Valley for my birthday.
She'd been right, of course. David showed up. He'd been there for my promotion to senior partner, for my father's heart attack scare, for the difficult weeks when I'd been working the Morrison case and barely sleeping. He'd learned to cook my favorite Thai curry, remembered that I liked my coffee with almond milk but no sugar, bought me books by authors I'd mentioned in passing months earlier. But as I'd zipped up my wedding dress that morning, smoothing the silk over my hips while my mother fastened the pearl necklace around my throat, I'd caught myself wondering if showing up was enough. If the steady, comfortable love David offered could fill the space that Marcus's sudden absence had carved out of my chest 3 years ago. "Stop it," I'd whispered to my reflection in the full-length mirror. "Stop comparing them. Stop living in the past." The past, however, had other plans. Now, walking down the cathedral aisle with Agent Chen's words echoing in my head, I understood that my carefully reconstructed life had been built on foundations of sand. Every decision I'd made since Marcus left, the apartment, the career focus, the relationship with David, had been shaped by a lie. I'd spent 3 years believing that Marcus had simply stopped loving me, that our relationship hadn't been strong enough to survive whatever personal crisis had driven him away. The truth was so much more complicated and so much worse. Marcus hadn't left because he'd stopped caring. He'd left because he'd cared too much, because his feelings for me had compromised an FBI investigation, because keeping me safe had required breaking both our hearts. As I moved slowly down the aisle, my mother's arms steady beneath mine, I found myself cataloging the faces of wedding guests with new eyes. Were any of them federal agents? Were any of them threats? The elderly woman in the third pew, Mrs. Henderson from my mother's bridge club, was she really who she appeared to be? The young man near the back with the camera, supposedly the photographer's assistant, why did his posture remind me so much of Marcus's hypervigilant stance? David was waiting at the altar, his face radiant with joy and nervousness. He'd gotten his hair cut too short the day before, the way he always did when he was anxious, and there was a small spot on his tie where he'd probably spilled coffee during his morning routine. He was so beautifully, earnestly normal, so completely unaware that the woman walking toward him was no longer the same person who'd kissed him goodbye that morning. I tried to imagine explaining this to him later. Surprise, honey, my ex-boyfriend is FBI. There's a Russian arms dealer who wants me dead, and our entire wedding is actually an elaborate protection detail. The absurdity of it made me want to laugh and cry simultaneously. Marcus caught my eye from his position along the wall, and I saw him tense slightly, his hand moving imperceptibly closer to whatever weapon he was carrying. He'd noticed something. A movement in the crowd, a face that didn't belong, some subtle shift in the atmosphere that his trained instincts had detected. My step faltered, and I felt my mother's grip tighten on my arm. "Keep walking," she murmured, her smile never wavering for the benefit of our guests. "Everything is fine. Marcus won't let anything happen to you." But everything wasn't fine. Nothing had been fine since the moment I'd seen that man in the courthouse elevator 3 years ago, even though I didn't understand the significance at the time. My entire adult life had been shaped by that 30-second encounter with Dmitry Volkov, by the way his cold eyes had cataloged my face, by the expensive watch that should have warned me he wasn't really a janitor. I'd been so naive then, so trusting. At 28, established in my career and starting my career at Henderson and Associates, I'd believed that justice was straightforward, that good people were safe, that love was uncomplicated. Marcus had been working on his doctoral thesis then, spending long nights in the university library researching criminal psychology, fascinated by the minds of people who chose violence as a solution to their problems. "Most criminals aren't that different from the rest of us," he'd told me one night as we shared Chinese takeout on my tiny apartment balcony. I'd thought it was academic curiosity then, the same way he devoured true crime podcasts and documentary series about serial killers. I'd teased him about his dark side, never
Realizing that his interest in criminal behavior was professional, that every conversation we'd had about justice and law enforcement had been filtered through knowledge and experience he couldn't share with me. How many times had he interviewed subjects for his thesis research who were actually suspects in federal investigations? How many late-night phone calls had been from his FBI handlers rather than his advisor? How many weekend trips to visit his family had actually been assignments in other cities? The weight of the deception was staggering. Not just Marcus's deception, but my mother's as well. Judge Patricia Montgomery, who'd raised me to value honesty above all else, who'd taught me that integrity was the foundation of both law and love, had been keeping secrets that put my life in danger. The thing about undercover work, Agent Chen had explained to me in the cathedral's vestibule, is that it requires complete commitment to the role. Agent Reed couldn't tell you the truth without compromising not just his investigation, but the safety of everyone involved, including you. The moment Kozlov's organization realized you could identify Dmitry Volkov, your life was forfeit unless we could keep you completely unaware of the threat. So they'd made me a ghost in my own life, a person who existed in carefully maintained ignorance while federal agents orchestrated events around me. When I'd applied for the job at Henderson and Associates, had that been my own achievement, or had strings been pulled behind the scenes? When I'd been assigned to work on cases involving corporate fraud and intellectual property disputes, had someone made sure I stayed away from anything connected to organized crime? Even my relationship with David, had that been organic, or had someone vetted him first, made sure he was safe, normal, unconnected to the dangerous world that swirled invisibly around my family? The questions were multiplying in my head like cancer cells, transforming every memory into something suspect, every relationship into a potential manipulation. By the time I reached the altar and handed my bouquet to Jessica, I felt hollow inside, scooped out by the realization that I'd been living someone else's life without knowing it. David took my hands in his palms warm and slightly damp with nervous perspiration. His brown eyes were bright with emotion, completely genuine in a way that made my chest ache with guilt.
Whatever complicated web of lies and protection had shaped my life, he had no part in it. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a good man who'd fallen in love with a woman who wasn't really who she'd claimed to be. "You look beautiful," he whispered as the priest began the opening words of the ceremony. "I can't believe we're really doing this." Neither could I, but for entirely different reasons. The priest was speaking about love and commitment, about the sacred bond between two souls choosing to share their lives, but his words felt like they were coming from underwater. My attention kept drifting to Marcus, to the way he'd positioned himself with a clear view of every entrance, and to the small communication device he was wearing that occasionally crackled with barely audible voices. How long had it been since I'd seen him look relaxed? Even when we were together, before I understood why, there had always been a thread of tension running through him, a watchfulness that I'd attributed to his intense personality. Now I recognized it for what it was, the hypervigilance of someone living under deep cover, someone who could never fully let his guard down because lives depended on his ability to react to threats. "The rings, please," the priest said, and David's best man stepped forward with the simple platinum bands we'd chosen together 3 months ago. Such a normal thing, picking out wedding rings, talking about engraving options and whether we wanted matching sets or individual styles. David had wanted to engrave "Forever Yours" inside my band, but I convinced him to go with our wedding date instead, something that felt less presumptuous about a future I was already uncertain about. As David slipped the ring onto my finger, I found myself remembering the promise ring Marcus had given me for my 26th birthday. It had been a simple silver band with a small sapphire, nothing elaborate or expensive, but he'd said it represented his intention to love me for as long as the universe would let him.
I'd worn it until the day he left, when I'd thrown it in the Potomac River during one of my darker moments, watching it disappear beneath the gray water like a small, bright piece of my heart. Now I understood what he'd meant about the universe not letting him love me. The FBI had other plans for Marcus Reed, plans that didn't include a normal life with a civilian who'd accidentally become a witness to federal crimes. "Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery," the priest continued, "do you take David Michael Harrison to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? Till death do us part." The words hung in the air like a prophecy, made more ominous by the knowledge that Kozlov's people were actively trying to make death part very soon. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. From his position along the wall, Marcus was speaking quietly into his communication device again, his gray eyes scanning the crowd with increased intensity. Something had changed in the last few minutes, some new intelligence or threat assessment that had heightened his alertness. "Sarah?" the priest prompted gently, and I realized that 300 wedding guests were waiting for my response, that David's hands were growing tense in mine, that I was on the verge of either committing to a marriage based on lies or creating a scene that could get everyone in this cathedral killed. "I do," I whispered, though the words felt like ashes in my mouth. But as David leaned in to kiss me, sealing our union with the traditional gesture of celebration, I caught sight of Marcus's face one more time. For just an instant, his professional mask slipped, and I saw the raw pain in his eyes. The cost of watching the woman he'd never stopped loving marry someone else in the name of keeping her safe. That's when I understood the true cruelty of what had been done to all of us. Marcus had been forced to sacrifice his personal happiness for duty. I'd been forced to live a lie for protection. David had been drawn into a marriage where his wife's heart was still partially claimed by a ghost from her past. And my mother had been forced to watch her daughter suffer rather than reveal the truth that might have gotten us all killed. The cathedral erupted in applause as David and I kissed, the sound echoing off the stone walls like thunder.
But all I could think about was the man in the black suit who was responsible for making sure I lived to see another day, and the impossible weight of secrets that had shaped every choice we'd made for the past 3 years. The reception was held at the Riverside Manor, a 19th century estate overlooking the Potomac River that had been in my mother's family for 4 generations. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated the way the late afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom, casting golden rectangles across the polished parquet floors. The centerpieces of white peonies and baby's breath that I'd agonized over for months were perfect, exactly as I had envisioned them, but they felt like decorations for someone else's celebration. I moved through the receiving line like a marionette, smiling and thanking guests for their attendance, while my mind cataloged every unfamiliar face, every person who seemed to be paying too much attention to my movements. Agent Chen had positioned herself near the gift table, playing the role of a distant cousin while maintaining a clear view of the main entrance. 2 other agents I'd been briefly introduced to, Agent Martinez and Agent Kumar, had taken positions as part of the catering staff, their formal training evident in the way they carried serving trays while never losing sight of potential threats. Marcus had changed into server's attire as well, his black suit replaced by the crisp white shirt and black vest of the catering company. But no amount of costume could disguise the predatory grace with which he moved through the crowd, the way his eyes constantly tracked exits and assessed sightlines. He was carrying a champagne tray now, offering drinks to guests, while maintaining his cover, but I could see the outline of his shoulder holster beneath the fitted vest.
Sarah, darling, you look absolutely radiant. Mrs. Pemberton, my mother's longtime friend from the federal judiciary, embraced me warmly, her Chanel perfume enveloping me in a cloud of sophisticated florals. Your mother must be so proud. Such a beautiful ceremony, and David seems like a lovely young man. I murmured appropriate responses, playing my part in the elaborate theater that my wedding had become, but my attention was drawn to a group of men near the bar who didn't quite fit with the other guests. They were well-dressed, expensive suits and watches, but there was something in their posture that spoke of violence held carefully in check. One of them, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and ice-blue eyes, seemed to be studying me with particular intensity. Marcus had noticed them too. I watched him adjust his position, moving closer to their group while maintaining his server persona, offering champagne while listening to their conversation. The subtle shake of his head when he caught my eye told me everything I needed to know. These men were not wedding guests. Sarah, we need to talk. Jessica appeared at my elbow, her usual bright smile replaced by an expression of barely controlled panic. She'd been mingling with the other bridesmaids, playing her role as maid of honor, but something had clearly shaken her composure. What's wrong? I asked, moving us toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, near a massive arrangement of white lilies that provided some visual cover from the crowd. I was in the ladies' room and I overheard 2 women talking in Russian, Jessica whispered, her brown eyes wide with fear. I took 4 years of Russian in college, so I understood most of it. They were saying something about the target looking younger than in the photographs and asking when they should move to the secondary location. The secondary location. My blood turned to ice water as I processed what Jessica had overheard. Agent Chen had briefed me on the basic parameters of the protection detail, but she'd been vague about specifics. Now I understood why. If Kozlov's people couldn't eliminate me at the wedding, they had backup plans, other locations where they could complete their mission with less risk of federal interference. Where are these women now? I asked, scanning the ballroom for faces I might not have noticed before, people who'd blended seamlessly into the celebration while harboring deadly intentions. Near the dessert table, Jessica replied, her voice barely audible above the gentle classical music that was providing background ambiance for the cocktail hour. The brunette in the navy dress and the blonde in emerald green. They look completely normal, Sarah. If I hadn't heard them talking, I never would have suspected anything. I followed her gaze and spotted them immediately. 2 well-dressed women in their 30s, attractive and professionally groomed, the kind of people who could attend any upscale social event without drawing unwanted attention. They were engaged in animated conversation with some of David's colleagues from his marketing firm, laughing at someone's joke while their eyes periodically swept the room in patterns that suggested surveillance training. The magnitude of what I was facing hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a simple assassination attempt by a lone gunman. Kozlov's organization had sent an entire team, people who'd studied my habits and relationships, who had infiltrated my wedding with the precision of a military operation. They'd probably been planning this for months, watching me, learning my routines, identifying opportunities to strike with minimal risk of detection. "Mrs. Harrison, congratulations on your marriage." The voice came from directly behind me, accented with the kind of Eastern European pronunciation that my spine locked with terror. I turned slowly to find the tall man with gray hair and ice blue eyes standing less than 3 feet away, a champagne flute in his manicured hands and a smile that didn't reach his cold gaze. "Thank you," I managed, my voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've been introduced." "Viktor Petrov," he replied, offering a slight bow that spoke of old-world manners and new-world danger. "I am associate of your mother's work. We have many mutual connections in the legal community." The name meant nothing to me, but the way he'd positioned himself, blocking my natural retreat path while maintaining plausible conversation distance, suggested professional experience with intimidation. Behind him, I could see the 2 women Jessica had identified, and they were no longer engaged with David's colleagues. They were watching our interaction with the focused attention of predators who'd cornered their prey.
"How wonderful," I said, fighting to keep my voice level while my mind raced through escape options. "I'm sure my mother will be delighted to know you're here. She's over by the windows, if you'd like to say hello." But Petrov made no move to seek out my mother. Instead, he took a half step closer, his presence radiating the kind of controlled menace that made my skin crawl with primitive warning signals. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you privately," he continued, his English precise despite the accent, "about a mutual friend we both know. Perhaps we could step outside to garden. Is beautiful evening very romantic for new bride?" Every instinct I possessed was screaming danger, but I was trapped in the middle of my own wedding reception, surrounded by 300 innocent people who had no idea they were sharing space with professional killers. If I caused a scene, if I ran or called for help, how many guests might be caught in whatever violence followed? "That's very kind," I replied, playing for time while desperately hoping Marcus was monitoring this conversation. "But I really should stay with my guests, perhaps later this evening?" Petrov's smile widened, but his eyes remained arctic. "I think you misunderstand, Mrs. Harrison. This is not request." Before I could respond, a champagne flute appeared between us, held by a familiar hand that I recognized even before I looked up to see Marcus's face. He'd moved with the silent efficiency of a hunting cat, positioning himself at Petrov's shoulder while maintaining the casual demeanor of a server offering refreshments. "Champagne, sir?" Marcus asked politely, but there was steel beneath the courteous tone. "The bride's family has selected an excellent vintage for the celebration." Petrov's entire body language shifted as he sensed the threat behind him. These were 2 apex predators, sizing each other up in a room full of sheep, their deadly intentions hidden beneath layers of social convention and professional courtesy. "How thoughtful," Petrov replied, accepting the champagne without taking his eyes off me. "You must be very proud to work for such distinguished family." "Indeed," Marcus responded, his gray eyes meeting mine for just a fraction of a second. In that brief contact, I saw a world of communication, reassurance, instruction, and something that looked suspiciously like an apology for what was about to happen. The ballroom lights flickered suddenly, a brief interruption that might have been electrical interference or might have been a signal. In the momentary dimness, I saw movement throughout the room, the 2 Russian women by the dessert table straightening with alert attention, Agent Chen abandoning her position near the gift table to move closer to our group. Other figures I now recognized as federal agents shifting from their cover positions.
Sarah, there you are! David's voice cut through the tension like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. My new husband appeared at my side, his face flushed with champagne and happiness, completely oblivious to the deadly chess match being played around him. I've been looking everywhere for you. The photographer wants to take some sunset shots by the river before it gets too dark. The innocent normalcy of his request created a surreal contrast to the life and death stakes of my conversation with Petrov. Here was my husband, concerned about wedding photos and golden hour lighting, while 3 feet away stood a man who'd probably killed dozens of people and was planning to make me the next name on his list. Of course, darling, I said, reaching for David's offered hand like it was an anchor in a storm. Mr. Petrov was just introducing himself. Perhaps we'll have a chance to talk more later. But as I moved toward David, Petrov's hand shot out to grasp my wrist, his fingers closing around the delicate bones with carefully measured pressure, enough to stop me, not quite enough to leave visible bruises that would alarm the other guests. I think you will find that later may be too late for many things. Some conversations, they cannot wait for convenient time. The ballroom seemed frozen around us. David's face was transitioning from confusion to alarm as he processed the stranger's grip on his wife's wrist. Jessica had gone pale, her champagne flute trembling in her hands as she witnessed something that clearly wasn't normal wedding reception behavior. Other guests were beginning to notice the tableau,
Conversations pausing as they sensed tension without understanding its source. Marcus moved with liquid precision, his champagne tray disappearing as he stepped directly beside Petrov, with the kind of casual efficiency that spoke of extensive combat training. "Sir, I think you may have had a bit too much to celebrate," Marcus said conversationally, but his hand was now resting on Petrov's wrist, the same wrist that was holding me captive. "Perhaps you'd like to step outside for some fresh air. I'd be happy to escort you." The physical contact between the two men lasted less than 3 seconds, but in that brief moment, I watched Petrov's face cycle through a series of expressions: surprise, pain, and then a grudging respect that suggested Marcus had applied pressure to nerve points that only someone with specialized training would know how to target. Petrov released my wrist immediately, flexing his fingers with the careful attention of someone assessing potential damage. When he looked at Marcus again, it was with the professional acknowledgement of one predator recognizing another. "Very good," Petrov murmured, his voice pitched too low for David or the other guests to hear. "But you cannot protect her everywhere, every moment. Eventually, she will have to step outside the circle of federal protection." "That's enough." Agent Chen materialized beside our group with the smooth authority of someone accustomed to taking command of dangerous situations. She'd abandoned her cover as a family friend, and there was nothing subtle about the way her jacket fell open to reveal the badge and weapon at her belt. "Mr. Petrov, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," she continued, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that brooked no argument. "We have some questions about your invitation to this event." But Petrov was already backing away, his hands raised in a gesture of mock surrender that fooled no one. "Of course, Agent Chen. I am always happy to cooperate with federal authorities, though I think you will find my documentation is completely in order." He turned to me one final time, offering that cold smile that made my blood freeze. "Mrs. Harrison, please accept my congratulations on your marriage. I do hope you will have many happy years together." The emphasis he placed on many and years transformed the traditional wedding blessing into something that sounded suspiciously like a threat. Then he was moving through the crowd with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years learning how to disappear into backgrounds and blend with civilians. "David, we need to go," I said urgently, grabbing my husband's arm as the full implications of what had just happened began to sink in. "Right now." But David was staring after Petrov with the confused expression of someone trying to process an encounter that didn't fit any of his normal social categories. "Sarah, what just happened? Who was that man and why did he grab you like that?" Before I could answer, the lights went out completely. The ballroom plunged into absolute darkness, the kind of thick blackness that transforms familiar spaces into alien landscapes. For a heartbeat, there was complete silence, as if 300 people had collectively held their breath. Then the screaming started.
It began with a woman's high-pitched shriek near the main entrance, followed immediately by the crash of overturning tables and the musical destruction of champagne flutes hitting the parquet floor. In the darkness, I could hear the distinctive sound of expensive fabric tearing, high heels running across hardwood, and the deeper voices of men shouting instructions I couldn't quite make out. "Get down!" Marcus's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, and I felt his hand grab my shoulder, pulling me toward the floor with trained efficiency. "Everyone get down and stay down!" I hit the ground hard, my wedding dress billowing around me like a white silk parachute, and immediately felt David's body covering mine as he followed Marcus's shouted instruction. His weight was reassuring, protective, but I could feel the tremor in his hands that spoke of fear and confusion.
"Sarah, what's happening?" he whispered against my ear, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "This isn't normal, is it? Wedding receptions don't usually involve armed federal agents and mysterious strangers and power outages." Before I could answer, the emergency lighting kicked in. Dim red exit signs and battery-powered floor illumination that cast everything in an eerie crimson glow. The ballroom looked like a scene from a nightmare. Elegant wedding reception transformed into a disaster zone of overturned furniture, scattered floral arrangements, and guests crouched on the floor in various states of terror and confusion. But it was what I could see in that blood-red lighting that made my heart stop completely. The two Russian women Jessica had identified were no longer by the dessert table. They were moving through the crowd with predatory purpose, and the emerald green dress was no longer concealing whatever weapon the blonde had been carrying. In the crimson illumination, I could see the distinctive outline of a compact submachine gun, military-grade and designed for close-quarters combat. Agent Chen was shouting orders into her communication device, coordinating with other federal agents who were now abandoning their covers and revealing themselves throughout the ballroom. Agent Martinez had produced a shotgun from behind the bar, where he'd been posing as a bartender. Agent Kumar was herding guests toward the safest corner of the room, away from windows and potential lines of fire. And Marcus? Marcus was moving through the chaos like a force of nature, his server's vest abandoned to reveal the tactical gear underneath. He had his service weapon drawn, a matte black pistol that looked deadly serious in the emergency lighting, and he was tracking the movement of threats with the focused intensity of someone who'd done this many times before. "The bride," I heard one of the Russian women say, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the room, as guests realized this wasn't some elaborate wedding prank. "Where is the bride?" That's when I understood with crystalline clarity that this had never been about a random threat or a general attempt to disrupt my wedding. This was a coordinated assassination attempt, planned and executed by professionals who'd studied my life in detail. The power outage wasn't an accident. It was tactical cover, designed to create confusion and provide concealment for what came next. They were hunting me specifically, and they weren't going to let 300 innocent wedding guests stop them from completing their mission. "Marcus," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to where he was positioned near the overturned head table. "They're looking for me." His gray eyes found mine across the chaos, and in them I saw something I'd never witnessed during our 2 years together. The cold, efficient mindset of someone who'd killed people for a living. This wasn't the graduate student who'd spent lazy Sunday mornings reading research papers and making pancakes. This was Agent Marcus Reed, FBI, and he was very good at his job. "Stay exactly where you are," he mouthed, his lips forming the words with exaggerated precision so I could read them in the dim lighting. "Do not move until I come for you." But the blonde with the submachine gun was getting closer, methodically searching through clusters of terrified guests, checking faces against some internal catalog of identification. She was maybe 20 feet away now, close enough that I could see the professional calm in her expression, the way she held her weapon with the casual competence of extensive training. David's hand found mine beneath the folds of my wedding dress, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture of protection and solidarity. "Sarah, I don't understand what's happening, but whatever it is, we're gonna get through it together, okay?" The simple sincerity of his words broke something inside my chest.
Here was a man who'd married me that afternoon, expecting a normal life together. Weekend trips to farmers markets, arguments about mortgage rates, maybe children someday who would inherit his brown eyes and steady temperament. Instead, he'd found himself lying on a ballroom floor while armed killers searched for his wife among the wreckage of their wedding reception. "David, I'm so sorry," I whispered, squeezing his hand as tightly as I could. "I'm sorry I brought this into your life. I'm sorry I didn't know enough to warn you."
But there was no time for further apologies. The blonde had spotted us, her predatory gaze locking onto my white dress like a heat-seeking missile finding its target. She raised her weapon with smooth efficiency, the barrel swinging toward our position with mechanical precision. That's when Marcus Reed proved exactly why the FBI had trusted him to keep me alive. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space of the ballroom, a sound that seemed to punch through my chest and reverberate in my bones. But it wasn't the blonde submachine gun that had fired. It was Marcus's service weapon, the sharp crack of a precision shot that found its target with lethal accuracy. The blonde spun sideways, her weapon clattering across the parquet floor as Marcus's bullet caught her in the shoulder, spinning her away from our position and sending her crashing into the remains of the head table. Blood bloomed across the emerald fabric of her dress like dark flowers, and her face contorted with pain and rage as she pressed her remaining good hand against the wound. "Federal agents!" Agent Chen's voice boomed through the ballroom with amplified authority as she activated some kind of portable loudspeaker system. "Everyone remain on the ground. This is an active law enforcement operation." But the chaos was far from over. The brunette in navy was returning fire now, her own weapon, a compact pistol that she'd somehow concealed beneath her elegant evening attire, spitting bright muzzle flashes in the emergency lighting. She was aiming for Marcus, trying to eliminate the primary threat to their mission, but he was already moving, rolling behind the overturned gift table with the fluid grease of someone who'd done this dance many times before. David was pulling me closer, his body shielding mine as we pressed against the base of a marble pillar that offered some protection from the crossfire. I could feel his heart hammering against my back, his breathing rapid and shallow with adrenaline and fear. "This is real," he kept whispering, as if saying it aloud might help him process what was happening. "This is really real. People are shooting guns at my wedding." Agent Martinez had flanked the brunette, her shotgun trained on her position, while Agent Kumar coordinated the evacuation of guests toward the ballroom's secondary exits. But there were too many people, too much confusion, too many potential casualties if this escalated into a full firefight. "Kozlov sends his regards," the brunette called out in accented English, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom despite the chaos. "You cannot hide forever, little witness. We will find you tonight, tomorrow, next week. Russian memory is very long." That's when my mother's voice cut through the gunfire and confusion like a blade through silk. "Enough." Judge Patricia Montgomery stepped out from behind the bar where she had taken cover, her champagne-colored dress somehow still pristine despite the chaos around her. But what froze everyone in the ballroom, federal agents and Russian assassins alike, was the compact revolver she held with the steady grip of someone intimately familiar with firearms. Svetlana Volkov, daughter of Dmitry Volkov, niece of Viktor Kozlov, you're a long way from Brighton Beach. The brunette Svetlana lowered her weapon slightly, confusion flickering across her features at being identified so precisely. "You know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Patricia replied, taking a step closer with the fearless confidence of someone who'd spent decades staring down dangerous criminals in her courtroom.
From my position behind the marble pillar, I watched this surreal confrontation between my mother and a professional assassin, trying to process how Judge Patricia Montgomery, who taught me to drive and helped me pick out my prom dress and cried when I graduated law school, had suddenly transformed into someone who could identify Russian criminals by sight and hold a gun like she had been born with one in her hand.
You think federal protection will save your daughter? Svetlana spat, but there was uncertainty in her voice now, as if my mother's unexpected knowledge had shifted the tactical situation in ways she hadn't anticipated. You think we cannot reach her wherever you hide her? I think, Patricia said calmly, that you don't understand what you're dealing with. Sarah isn't just a witness to your uncle's activities at the courthouse. She's bait. Bait. The word hit me like a physical blow, reshaping everything I thought I understood about the past 3 years, about my mother's protection, about Marcus's assignment to keep me safe. I wasn't a victim who'd accidentally witnessed a crime. I was a lure, deliberately positioned to draw Kozlov's organization into the open, where federal agents could eliminate them. You're lying, Svetlana said, but her weapon was wavering now, uncertainty affecting her aim as she processed the implications of my mother's revelation. Agent Reed, Patricia called out without taking her eyes off Svetlana, please explain to Miss Volkov what Operation Nightingale was really designed to accomplish. Marcus rose from his position behind the gift table, his service weapon still trained on the wounded blonde while his gray eyes found mine across the chaos of the ballroom. In his face, I saw confirmation of my worst fears, that nothing about my life had been accidental, that every choice I had made had been guided by federal handlers who'd shaped my existence to serve their operational needs. Operation Nightingale was designed to eliminate Kozlov's entire network. Sarah Montgomery was placed under surveillance and protection not just as a witness, but as the primary asset in a larger strategy to draw out every member of the organization. The ballroom had gone completely silent, except for the soft moaning of the wounded blonde and the distant sound of sirens approaching from outside. 300 wedding guests were witnessing the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my own life, listening as my existence was reduced to operational terminology and strategic objectives. Every threat against her life, Marcus continued, every attempt to locate or harm her provided intelligence about Kozlov's network structure, communication methods, and operational priorities. Tonight was never about preventing an assassination attempt. It was about documenting one, identifying all the players, and eliminating them simultaneously. I felt David's arms tighten around me as he processed what he was hearing. His wife wasn't just an innocent victim, she was the central component in a federal operation that had put everyone in this ballroom at risk. How many? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. How many people have you identified tonight? Agent Chen stepped forward, lowering her communication device as she coordinated with the tactical teams that were now surrounding the building. 12 confirmed operatives, including support personnel and surveillance teams, the largest concentration of Kozlov assets we've ever managed to locate simultaneously. And you used my wedding as the trap, I said, the full scope of the betrayal beginning to sink in. You turned my marriage into a federal sting operation. Sarah, Marcus started, but I held up my hand to stop him. No, I said, struggling to my feet despite David's attempts to keep me safe behind the pillar. No more lies, no more protection, no more operations. I want the truth, all of it, right now. My mother lowered her revolver, the weapon disappearing into her purse with practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time she had carried concealed firearms. Darling, sit down. There are still hostile actors unaccounted for, and Mom, my voice cut through her judicial authority like acid through steel.
Tell me what you did. Tell me what you've all done to my life." Patricia Montgomery looked around the ruined ballroom, at the overturned tables and scattered flowers, at the wedding guests who were slowly beginning to emerge from their hiding places, at the federal agents who were securing the wounded Russian operatives, and her daughter in a blood-stained wedding dress demanding answers to questions that would destroy any remaining illusion of normalcy. 18 months ago, she began slowly, Viktor Kozlov was arrested based on intelligence gathered during a joint FBI-DEA operation targeting Russian arms trafficking in the Mid-Atlantic region. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, intercepted communications, testimony from multiple witnesses who'd been granted federal protection.
She paused, her composed mask slipping to reveal the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying impossible secrets for too long. But Kozlov's organization began systematically eliminating everyone connected to his prosecution. Witnesses, their families, law enforcement officers, even clerks and court reporters who'd had access to sensitive documents. And then you remembered that I'd seen Dmitry Volkov at the courthouse, I said, the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to form a complete picture. You realized I could identify him. Place him at the scene of his intelligence-gathering operation. We realized, Agent Chen interjected, that you were the only living witness who could connect Dmitry Volkov to the courthouse surveillance that led to his uncle's arrest. Without your testimony, Kozlov could appeal his conviction successfully. But instead of just putting me in witness protection, I continued, my voice growing stronger as my anger built, you decided to use me as bait to draw out his entire organization. Marcus stepped closer, his gray eyes pleading for understanding. Sarah, it wasn't like that. The protection was real. The feelings were real. Everything I felt for you was real. But the relationship started as an assignment, I shot back. You were ordered to get close to me, to monitor my activities, to make sure I stayed safe until you needed me to testify. Yes, he admitted, the word falling between us like a stone into still water. But what happened between us, that wasn't part of the operation. That wasn't something I could control or compartmentalize. David was watching this exchange with the stunned expression of someone witnessing the complete collapse of his understanding of reality. His wife was arguing with her ex-boyfriend about federal operations and surveillance assignments on their wedding day, while Russian assassins bled on the ballroom floor and tactical teams prepared to storm the building. So, when you realized your feelings were compromising the operation, I said to Marcus, you left. You disappeared without explanation because you couldn't tell me the truth without destroying years of careful planning. I left because I thought it would keep you safe, Marcus replied, his professional composure finally cracking to reveal the pain he'd been carrying for 3 years. I thought if I removed myself from the equation, you could have a normal life while the operation continued in the background. But there was never going to be a normal life, I said, looking around at the chaos of my ruined wedding reception, because this was always the endgame, wasn't it? Eventually, you were always going to use me as bait to draw them out. Agent Chen checked her communication device as more tactical units reported their positions around the building. Ms. Montgomery, we have 8 more suspects in custody outside the building, including Viktor Petrov and 2 vehicles full of surveillance equipment. This operation has been more successful than we dared hope. Successful? I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. My wedding has been destroyed. My marriage started with gunfire and blood. My husband has learned that his wife is the centerpiece of a federal operation, and you call this successful? We call it necessary, my mother said quietly. Sarah, if we hadn't acted tonight, if we hadn't drawn them out and eliminated them simultaneously, you would have spent the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. They would have never stopped hunting you. And now that you've arrested them all, now that you've gotten what you needed from Operation Nightingale, what happens to me? The question hung in the air like smoke, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable.
Outside, I could hear the sound of helicopter rotors and multiple sirens, the entire apparatus of federal law enforcement descending on what had supposed to have been the happiest day of my life. Marcus holstered his weapon and moved closer, his gray eyes holding depths of regret and longing that made my chest ache with remembered pain. "Sarah, I know how this looks. I know how betrayed you must feel, but everything I've done for the past 3 years has been about protecting you."
"Protecting me?" I said softly. "Or protecting the operation?" It was the question that cut to the heart of everything. Whether I'd been a person worth saving or an asset worth preserving. Whether the love I'd shared with Marcus had been real or merely a convenient cover for his assignment. Whether my mother's judicial authority had been used to seek justice or to manipulate her own daughter into serving federal interests. The emergency lighting flickered, casting shifting shadows across the ballroom as backup power systems struggled to maintain illumination. In that unstable light, I could see David still crouched beside the marble pillar where I'd left him, his face pale with shock and something that might have been the beginning of understanding about the woman he'd married. "Mrs. Harrison," Agent Chen said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but we need to debrief you on what happened here tonight. There will be reports to file, testimony to prepare, legal proceedings that will require your participation." Legal proceedings. More court dates, more testimony, more years of my life devoted to ensuring that Viktor Kozlov and his organization faced justice for their crimes. The operational framework that had shaped my existence for the past 3 years wasn't ending, it was just transitioning into a new phase. I looked at my mother, still elegant and composed despite the chaos around her, still every inch the federal judge who'd built her career on the principle that justice was worth any personal sacrifice. I looked at Marcus, whose gray eyes held 3 years of unspoken apologies and explanations that could never fully bridge the gap between duty and love. I looked at David, my husband of 6 hours, whose steady, normal life had just been shattered by the discovery that he'd married into a world of federal operations and Russian arms dealers. And I made a decision that surprised everyone in the ballroom, including myself. "No," I said clearly, my voice carrying with the authority I'd learned from years of practicing law and being Patricia Montgomery's daughter. "No more debriefings, no more operations, no more testimony. I'm done." 8 months later, I was sitting in a small cafe in Savannah, Georgia, watching the morning sun filter through Spanish moss as tourists began their daily pilgrimage through the historic district. The cafe served the kind of strong, chicory-laced coffee that could wake the dead, and I'd developed a routine of arriving early enough to claim the corner table by the window where I could observe the world without feeling like I was being observed in return. The woman looking back at me from the reflection in the cafe window bared little resemblance to the person who'd stood in a blood-stained wedding dress 6 months ago, demanding answers from federal agents. That woman was Sarah Montgomery, corporate lawyer, daughter of a federal judge, unwitting centerpiece of a 3-year counterintelligence operation. This woman was Sarah Collins, freelance legal consultant, resident of a converted carriage house on Jones Street, and someone who'd learned the hard way that sometimes the only path to freedom was complete reinvention. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 weeks ago. David had been surprisingly understanding, considering the circumstances. "I married someone who doesn't exist," he'd said during one of our last conversations, his voice holding sadness but no anger. "And you married someone who deserved better than to be dragged into a federal operation without his knowledge or consent." He'd been right, of course. Our marriage had been built on a foundation of secrets and half-truths, not because either of us had intended deception, but because my entire life had been shaped by forces I hadn't understood. David deserved a partner who could offer him the simple, honest love he'd been seeking. I'd been too damaged by betrayal and manipulation to be that person. My mother had been less understanding about my decision to leave. "You can't just disappear," she'd argued during our final conversation, her judicial authority clashing against my newfound determination to control my own destiny.
The justice system used me as bait without my knowledge or consent. The justice system destroyed my relationship, my marriage, and my sense of reality. I think I've fulfilled my obligations.
The legal complications had been significant. Extracting myself from Operation Nightingale's aftermath had required months of negotiations with federal prosecutors, immunity agreements, and carefully worded statements that satisfied the government's need for documentation without requiring my ongoing participation in the prosecution of Kozlov's organization. Agent Chen had been surprisingly helpful during the process, perhaps because she'd witnessed firsthand how the operation had cost me everything I'd thought I valued. Most people don't walk away from federal protection, she'd told me during one of our final meetings. Most people are grateful for the safety it provides. Most people, I'd replied, aren't told on their wedding day that their entire adult life has been a lie. Marcus had tried to contact me repeatedly during those first few months. Letters forwarded through my attorney, messages left with Jessica, even an attempted visit to my apartment that I'd refused to acknowledge. I had understood that he was carrying his own burden of guilt and regret, but I hadn't been ready to forgive. Not him, not my mother, not the system that had used my love and trust as weapons against people who'd wanted me dead. The hardest part hadn't been the anger. Anger was clean, pure, energizing in its clarity. The hardest part had been accepting that the love Marcus and I had shared had been real, even though it had been built on a foundation of operational necessity. He genuinely cared for me, had probably loved me as much as someone living under deep cover could love a civilian, but he'd also been a federal agent with a job to do. The cafe door chimed softly as another customer entered, and I glanced up from my laptop, where I'd been working on a trademark dispute for a small Savannah arts collective. The legal work I did now was different from my corporate practice, more personal, more connected to actual human needs rather than abstract intellectual property concepts. I helped local businesses navigate regulatory requirements, assisted artists with contract negotiations, provided legal support for people who couldn't afford the kind of white shoe law firm where I'd once been a partner. It was meaningful work, but it was also work that didn't require me to trust anyone with my personal safety or emotional well-being. I'd learned to value independence in ways I'd never understood when my life had been shaped by other people's agendas. The cafe door chimed softly as another customer entered, and I glanced up from my laptop, where I'd been working on a trademark dispute for a small Savannah arts collective. The legal work I did now was different from my corporate practice, more personal, more connected to actual human needs rather than abstract intellectual property concepts. I helped local businesses navigate regulatory requirements, assisted artists with contract negotiations, provided legal support for people who couldn't afford the kind of white shoe law firm where I had once been a partner. It was meaningful work, but it was also work that didn't require me to trust anyone with my personal safety or emotional well-being. I'd learned to value independence in ways I'd never understood when my life had been shaped by other people's agendas. My phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting my people-watching. It was from Jessica, who'd remained my closest friend despite the chaos that had surrounded our wedding day. Saw the news about Kozlov's sentencing, life without parole upheld on appeal, thought you should know. I stared at the message for a long moment, processing information that should have felt like closure, but instead felt like confirmation that the world had moved on without me. Viktor Kozlov would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, his organization dismantled, his network of arms trafficking and money laundering permanently disrupted. Justice had been served, the system had worked, and I'd played my part in ensuring that dangerous criminals face consequences for their actions. But I'd paid a price for that justice that no one seemed interested in calculating. The cost of a life built on deception, of relationships destroyed by operational necessity, of trust so thoroughly shattered that rebuilding it might take years. Another text arrived, this one from an unknown number. "Sarah, it's Marcus. I know you don't want to hear from me, but there's something you need to know. Can we talk?" I stared at the message until the screen went dark, my reflection appearing in the black glass like a ghost of my former self.
For 6 months, I'd successfully avoided any contact with Marcus Reed, had built a new life that didn't include federal agents or counterintelligence operations or complicated explanations about the difference between duty and love. But curiosity was a dangerous thing, and despite everything that had happened, I still wanted to understand. What could be so important that he'd risk contacting me after months of respecting my clearly stated need for space? I typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on 5 minutes. Call me. My phone rang almost immediately. Sarah. His voice was exactly as I remembered, deep, careful, edged with the kind of intensity that had first attracted me to him years ago. Thank you for taking my call. What do you need, Marcus? I kept my voice neutral, professional, the tone I might use with a client whose case I wasn't particularly interested in taking. I'm leaving the bureau, he said simply. My resignation is effective at the end of the month. The announcement hit me like a physical blow, unexpected and disorienting in its implications. Marcus had been FBI for 8 years, had built his career around federal law enforcement, had sacrificed personal happiness for operational success. Leaving the bureau wasn't a casual decision, it was the dismantling of an identity. Why? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Because I can't be the person who destroyed your life and continue to work for the system that made it necessary, he replied, his voice carrying a weight of exhaustion I'd never heard before. Because every case I work reminds me of what we did to you, and I can't live with that anymore. Through the cafe window, I watched a horse-drawn carriage full of tourists clip-clop past on the cobblestone street, the guide pointing out architectural details and sharing sanitized historical anecdotes about Savannah's antebellum past. It was a carefully constructed version of history, beautiful and engaging, but missing the complexity and moral ambiguity that had shaped the real story of this place. What will you do? I found myself asking, despite my determination to remain emotionally detached from this conversation. I've been accepted to a doctoral program in criminal psychology at the University of Georgia, Marcus said, going back to what I was doing before the Bureau recruited me. It feels like the right time to remember who I was before I became Agent Reed. It was exactly the kind of choice the old Marcus would have made, thoughtful, principled, designed to create something meaningful from the wreckage of what had come before. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it might be like to rebuild a relationship with someone who was also rebuilding himself, two people learning to trust again after being broken by forces beyond their control. Sarah, Marcus continued, and I could hear something in his voice that sounded suspiciously like hope. I know I have no right to ask this, but I was wondering if you might be willing to meet with me. Not for the Bureau, not for any official purpose, just to talk, to try to understand what happened to us. The woman at the counter had received her complicated coffee order and was heading toward the door, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated what sounded like a challenging day full of meetings and deadlines. As she passed my table, I caught a fragment of her conversation. No, I can't reschedule the deposition. The witness has already traveled from out of state. Witness. The word followed her out the door like an echo, reminding me that somewhere in Atlanta or Washington or New York, there were probably other people whose lives had been shaped by federal operations, other civilians who'd become unwitting participants in government strategies they'd never fully understand. I don't know if that's a good idea, I said finally. Though even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was going to say yes. Curiosity had always been one of my weaknesses, and despite everything that had happened, I still wanted to understand how someone could love another person and betray them simultaneously. One conversation, 1 hour. If you decide afterward that you never want to see me again, I'll respect that completely. Outside, a street musician had set up near the cafe, his guitar case open for donations as he played a melancholy acoustic version of The Night We Met. The irony was almost too obvious, but the melody was beautiful, and several tourists had stopped to listen, dropping bills into his case as they absorbed the romance of live music in a historic setting. Where? I asked. Anywhere you feel safe, Marcus replied immediately. Your choice, your terms.
I thought about the question seriously. Where did I feel safe? Not in my converted carriage house, which was my sanctuary, but also too intimate for this conversation. Not in a restaurant or bar where we might be overheard or recognized. Not in any federal building or government facility for obvious reasons. Forsyth Park, I said finally. Saturday morning, 10 a.m. by the fountain. 1 hour. Thank you, he said. And the relief in his voice was so evident that I felt an unwelcome flutter of the old connection we'd shared. Sarah, 1 hour, Marcus, I interrupted. We'll see what happens after that. I ended the call before he could say anything else, before I could be drawn back into the complicated web of emotion and regret that had defined our relationship. But as I closed my laptop and gathered my things to leave the cafe, I found myself thinking about the street musician's song choice and wondering if there really was a way to go back to the night we'd met and make different choices. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool with the kind of crisp October air that reminded me of autumns in Washington, D.C., back when I thought my biggest challenges were partnership tracks and billable hour requirements. I'd chosen jeans and a simple sweater, clothes that felt like armor against vulnerability, and arrived at Forsyth Park 15 minutes early to claim psychological advantage in whatever conversation was about to unfold. The park was busy with weekend activity, families pushing strollers along the tree-lined paths, dog walkers navigating the off-leash areas, joggers maintaining steady rhythms around the park's perimeter. The fountain at the center was a popular destination for tourists, its ornate Victorian design providing a picturesque backdrop for countless photographs and marriage proposals. I'd positioned myself on a bench with a clear view of all the main approaches, a habit I had developed during my months of hypervigilance after the wedding. Trust might be slowly returning to my life, but situational awareness had become a permanent fixture of my personality. Marcus appeared exactly at 10 a.m., approaching from the north entrance with the punctuality that had always been one of his defining characteristics. He looked different, younger somehow, despite the months that had passed. His hair was longer, less precisely cut, and he was wearing civilian clothes that reminded me of his graduate student days. But it was his posture that had changed most dramatically. The hypervigilant tension I'd learned to associate with Agent Reed was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. "You came," he said as he reached my bench, his gray eyes holding a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. I said I would. I gestured to the space beside me on the bench, maintaining the careful, emotional distance I had cultivated over the past 6 months. "You have an hour." He sat down, leaving appropriate space between us, and for a moment we simply watched the fountain together in silence. The water caught the morning sunlight, creating tiny rainbows in the spray, and children were tossing coins into the basin, making wishes I hoped would come true for them. "I've been seeing a therapist," Marcus said, his voice quiet enough that only I could hear him. "Someone who specializes in helping federal agents transition back to civilian life. She's been helping me understand how much of myself I lost during those 8 years undercover." I hadn't expected him to lead with vulnerability, and the admission caught me off guard. "What did you learn?" "That I don't know who I am when I'm not pretending to be someone else," he replied, his hands clasped loosely in his lap as he watched a family of ducks paddle across the fountain's basin. "That I've spent so many years living false identities that I'm not sure there's anything authentic left underneath." It was an honesty I'd never heard from him during our 2 years together, when he'd been carefully maintaining the fiction of being a graduate student while actually serving as a federal agent. This version of Marcus, uncertain, introspective, willing to admit weakness, felt more real than the man I'd thought I'd loved. "The night I left you," he continued, "I told myself it was about protecting you. And that was true, as far as it went. But it was also about protecting myself from having to choose between the mission and my feelings for you." "And now?" I asked, surprised by my own willingness to engage with this conversation. Now I understand that the choice was always an illusion, Marcus said, turning to face me for the first time since he'd sat down. The Bureau had already made the decision for me. They were always going to use you as bait, always going to prioritize the operation over our relationship. I just couldn't admit that to myself at the time. A jogger passed our bench, her ponytail bouncing with each stride, and I found myself envying her simple focus on personal fitness goals rather than complicated questions about love and betrayal and federal operations. "So, what do you want from me?" I asked. "Forgiveness? Absolution? Permission to move on with your life?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying my face with the careful attention I remembered from our early days together, when he'd seemed fascinated by every expression that crossed my features. "I want to apologize," he said finally, "not as Agent Reed, not as someone following operational protocols, but as Marcus, who fell in love with Sarah and then made choices that destroyed both our lives." The apology hung in the air between us, like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. For 6 months, I'd been angry. At him, at my mother, at the system that had manipulated us both. Anger had been clean and energizing, easier to carry than the complex mixture of love and loss and regret that lay underneath. "I loved you," I said quietly, the admission feeling dangerous even months after our relationship had ended. "I loved you completely, and I thought you were the person I was going to build a life with." Finding out that everything I believed about us was built on lies, it broke something in me that I'm still trying to repair. "I know," Marcus replied, his voice rough with emotion. "But, Sarah, I need you to understand. Every moment we shared that wasn't directly related to the operation was real. Every conversation, every laugh, every time I held you while you fell asleep, that was me, not Agent Reed." I wanted to believe him. Despite everything that had happened, despite the months of rebuilding my life from scratch, I wanted to believe that the connection we'd shared had been genuine, rather than merely a convenient cover for his assignment. How do I know the difference? How do I separate Marcus from Agent Reed when you've admitted you don't know who you are without the false identities? It was the question that cut to the heart of everything. Not just our relationship, but the possibility of any relationship built after betrayal. How do you trust someone who spent years professionally deceiving people? How do you love someone who admitted they're not sure which parts of their personality are authentic? Marcus stood up from the bench and walked to the edge of the fountain, his hands deep in his pockets as he stared into the clear water where dozens of coins glittered like captured stars. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the space between us with the kind of careful honesty that felt like a gift. "I don't know if you can," he said simply. "I don't know if I'd be able to trust me in your position. But I can tell you that leaving the Bureau, going back to school, trying to figure out who I am without a badge and a cover identity, it feels like the first authentic choice I've made in years." A young couple approached the fountain, the man carrying a camera while the woman posed near the ornate stonework. They were laughing together, completely absorbed in their own happiness, and I found a stab of envy for their simple focus on personal fitness goals rather than complicated questions about love and betrayal and federal operations. "So what do you want from this conversation? What would constitute success from your perspective?" Marcus returned to the bench, but this time he sat facing me, his gray eyes holding mine with the intensity I remembered from our best moments together.
I want you to know that every day for the past 6 months, I've wished I could go back and make different choices, he said. I want you to know that walking away from you was the hardest thing I've ever done, and that I've regretted it every single day since. But you do it again, I said, understanding the truth even before he confirmed it. If you were in the same situation with the same operational requirements, you'd make the same choice. Yes, he admitted, his honesty as painful as it was refreshing. Because keeping you alive was more important than keeping you happy. Because loving someone sometimes means making choices that hurt them in order to protect them. The fountain continued its steady cascade, indifferent to human complications and emotional archaeology. Around us, Savannah continued its weekend rhythm of tourism and leisure, people pursuing simple pleasures without the weight of federal operations and Russian arms dealers and complicated questions about the intersection of duty and love. I need more time, I said, finally, standing up from the bench as our hour approached its end. I need to think about everything you've said, about what forgiveness might look like, about whether it's possible to build something new from the pieces of what we destroyed. Marcus did as well, maintaining careful distance but allowing hope to flicker across his features. How much time? I don't know, I replied honestly. Maybe months, maybe years, maybe forever. I'll wait, he said simply. However long it takes, whatever you decide, I'll wait. As I walked away from the fountain, leaving Marcus sitting alone on the bench where we'd attempted to excavate the truth from the ruins of our relationship, I realized that for the first time in 6 months, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted my future to look like. 18 months later, the university campus was alive with the energy of a new semester beginning, students carrying overstuffed backpacks and consulting campus maps as they navigated between dormitories and lecture halls. I parked my car in the visitor's lot outside the psychology building, checking my reflection in the rearview mirror before gathering the courage to walk into a world I'd been carefully avoiding for over 2 years. Marcus's doctoral defense was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'd been debating whether to attend for the past 3 weeks, ever since Jessica had forwarded me the announcement she'd seen in the University of Georgia alumni newsletter. Dr. Marcus Reed examining the psychological impact of long-term undercover operations on federal agents and their personal relationships. The irony of the dissertation topic wasn't lost on me. Marcus had turned our destroyed relationship into academic research, studying the psychological mechanisms that had shaped our experience while pursuing a career that might help other people navigate similar challenges. I'd spent the morning walking through downtown Athens, trying to understand why I felt compelled to witness this milestone in his life. We'd maintained minimal contact over the past 2 years, occasional emails about practical matters, a brief phone conversation when my mother had been hospitalized for pneumonia, a carefully neutral exchange of holiday cards that acknowledged our shared history without reopening emotional wounds. The psychology building was a modern structure of glass and steel, all clean lines and abundant natural light designed to suggest transparency and openness. A directory near the main entrance directed me to the 3rd floor, where a small crowd had gathered outside conference room 314. I recognized several faces from our graduate school days, professors who'd taught courses Marcus and I had taken together, fellow students who probably wondered why he had disappeared from the program years earlier. They were older now, established in their careers, discussing academic politics and research methodologies with the casual expertise of people who'd found their professional calling. Sarah? A familiar voice made me turn, and I found myself face to face with Dr. Elizabeth Chen, Marcus's former advisor, who'd guided his early research into criminal psychology before the FBI had recruited him away from academic life.
Dr. Chen, I replied, accepting her warm embrace with surprise. I wasn't sure you'd remember me. Of course I remember you, she said with a smile that held both warmth and curiosity. Marcus mentioned you might be coming today. I have to say, I'm impressed that he managed to turn such a personal experience into rigorous academic research. Through the open doorway of the conference room, I could see Marcus standing near a projection screen, consulting notes while his dissertation committee took their seats around a polished table. He was wearing a navy suit that reminded me of the one he'd worn to faculty dinners during our relationship, but his posture was different. More relaxed, more genuinely confident than the carefully controlled presence I'd learned to associate with Agent Reed. How has he been? I found myself asking, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Focused, Dr. Chen replied thoughtfully, driven to understand the psychological mechanisms that shaped his experience. But also, she paused, studying my face with the careful attention of someone trained to read emotional subtext. Also healing, I think. Finding ways to integrate his past experience with his current identity.
The conference room was filling up now, faculty members and graduate students claiming seats for what promised to be an unusually personal dissertation defense. Marcus's research had apparently attracted attention throughout the psychology department, offering insights into a world most academics only encountered through theoretical frameworks. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Chen announced, "we are ready to begin." I slipped into a seat near the back of the room, hoping to observe without being observed, but Marcus's gray eyes found mine immediately. For a moment, his carefully prepared composure wavered, surprise and something that might have been gratitude flickering across his features before he regained his professional focus. "Good afternoon." He began, his voice carrying the authority I remembered from our best conversations about criminal psychology. "My research examines the long-term psychological impact of sustained identity deception on federal agents and their personal relationships, with particular attention to the mechanisms by which operational requirements compromised authentic emotional attachment." The academic language created distance from the personal reality we'd lived through, transforming our love story into research variables and psychological constructs. But as Marcus continued his presentation, clicking through slides that documented patterns of emotional disengagement and relationship failure among undercover agents, I began to understand what he'd been doing for the past 2 years. He'd taken our pain and made it meaningful. He'd studied the forces that had destroyed us and developed frameworks that might help other people avoid similar devastation. Our broken relationship had become data in service of a larger understanding about the human cost of national security operations. "The central finding of this research," Marcus continued, "is that sustained identity deception creates what I term relational fragmentation, a psychological state in which individuals lose the ability to distinguish between authentic and operational emotions, leading to compromised capacity for genuine intimacy." A professor in the front row raised her hand. "Dr. Reed, how do you account for researcher bias in the study, given your personal experience with the phenomena you're investigating?" It was the question I'd been expecting, the challenge that went to the heart of whether Marcus could objectively study his own psychological trauma. His response revealed how much he'd grown during his years away from federal service. "That's an excellent question, Professor Martinez," he replied. "Rather than viewing my personal experience as a limitation, I've approached it as a unique source of insight, while implementing rigorous methodological controls to ensure objectivity. I've included detailed appendices documenting my own psychological journey as a case study, while maintaining analytical distance through peer review and external validation of findings." The defense continued for nearly an hour, with committee members probing Marcus's methodology, challenging his conclusions, and exploring the broader implications of his research for both law enforcement training and therapeutic intervention. He handled every question with the intellectual rigor that had first attracted me to him years ago, but also with a level of emotional intelligence that seemed newly developed.
"One final question," said Dr. Harrison, the committee chair. "What practical applications do you envision for this research?" Marcus paused, his eyes finding mine once more across the crowded room. "I believe this research could inform the development of support protocols for agents and their families, helping people understand the psychological costs of undercover work before they pay them. More broadly, it suggests that institutions requiring sustained deception from their personnel have an obligation to provide resources for psychological integration and relationship repair." Relationship repair. The phrase hung in the air like a promise, suggesting that the damage done by operational necessity might not be permanent, that people who'd lost themselves in false identities might find ways back to authentic connection. The committee retired for deliberation, leaving the audience to mill around the conference room while Marcus gathered his presentation materials with the careful attention of someone trying not to appear anxious about the outcome. Several colleagues approached him with congratulations and questions about his research, But I hung back, uncertain about whether this was an appropriate moment for a personal conversation. Sarah. He'd somehow extracted himself from the crowd of well-wishers and appeared beside me with the quiet efficiency I remembered from our early relationship. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure either, I admitted, looking around the room full of academics and researchers who represented the life he was building after federal service. But I wanted to see you defend your work. I wanted to understand what you'd made from everything that happened. Dr. Chen reappeared with the dissertation committee, their faces revealing nothing about their decision as they called the room to order for the final announcement. "It is our unanimous decision," Dr. Harrison announced, "that Marcus Reed has successfully defended his doctoral dissertation with distinction. Congratulations, Dr. Reed." The room erupted in applause, colleagues and fellow students surging forward to congratulate the newest PhD in the psychology department. I watched Marcus accept their praise with genuine humility, his gray eyes bright with the satisfaction of intellectual achievement earned through personal struggle. As the crowd began to disperse, I found myself walking toward the building's exit, my purpose in attending fulfilled, but my emotional state more complicated than I anticipated. Seeing Marcus succeed, watching him transform personal trauma into meaningful research, had stirred feelings I'd thought I'd successfully processed during my 2 years of careful independence. "Sarah, wait." His voice stopped me just outside the building's main entrance, and I turned to find him jogging across the courtyard with his suit jacket slung over his shoulder and his tie loosened in a way that reminded me powerfully of the graduate student I'd fallen in love with years ago. "Congratulations," I said, meaning it completely. "Your research was impressive. Really important work." "Thank you." But his expression suggested he wanted to say more than professional pleasantries would allow. "Sarah, I know this might not be the right time or place, but I was wondering if you might be willing to have dinner with me tonight. Not as a continuation of what we were before, but as, I don't know, as people who've learned things about themselves that they didn't know before." I studied his face, looking for traces of Agent Reed beneath the academic credentials and psychological insights. What I saw was someone who'd spent 2 years learning to be honest about his own limitations. Someone who'd turned personal failure into professional growth without losing sight of the human cost of that education. "One dinner," I said finally. "Somewhere public, somewhere safe." His smile was radiant, transforming his features in a way that reminded me why I'd once believed we could build a life together. "There's a restaurant downtown that serves the best shrimp and grits in Georgia. Very public, very safe, very civilian." 4 years later. The wedding was small, intimate, nothing like the elaborate federal operation that had masqueraded as my first marriage. 30 guests gathered in the garden behind my mother's house in Arlington, the same garden where I'd played as a child, where she'd taught me to identify different varieties of roses and explain the importance of nurturing things that brought beauty into the world. Marcus and I had taken our time rebuilding trust, approaching our relationship with the careful attention of people who understood how easily love could be compromised by deception and operational necessity. We'd spent 3 years in couples therapy, learning to distinguish between authentic emotion and the psychological patterns created by years of professional manipulation. The therapist, Dr. Susan Walsh, had specialized in helping federal agents and their families navigate the transition back to civilian relationships. "Love after betrayal," she'd told us during one of our early sessions, "requires conscious choice rather than romantic feeling. You have to decide every day to trust each other despite your knowledge of how easily trust can be broken." It had been hard work, rebuilding intimacy from the ground up while carrying the scars of what had been destroyed before. Marcus had to learn how to be vulnerable without the protection of false identity, how to share his real thoughts and feelings rather than carefully constructed personas. I had to learn how to trust again, how to believe that the person I was falling in love with was genuine rather than operational. But slowly, carefully, we'd found our way back to each other.
Not to the naive young couple we'd been before federal service complicated everything, but to something stronger and more conscious, built on mutual understanding of our own capacity for both love and self-protection. My mother performed the ceremony, her judicial robes replaced by a simple blue dress, but her authority intact as she spoke about the nature of commitment in a world where nothing was guaranteed except the choice to keep choosing each other. "Sarah and Marcus," she said, looking at us with eyes that held years of regret about the secret she'd kept and the protection she thought necessary, "you've learned that love isn't enough by itself. You've learned that trust must be earned and re-earned, that forgiveness is a daily practice rather than a single decision." In the front row, David sat with his new wife, Rebecca, a kindergarten teacher who brought out his gentle humor in ways I'd never been able to accomplish. We'd reconnected the previous year, not as former spouses, but as people who'd survived a shared trauma and found ways to build meaningful lives afterward. His presence at my second wedding felt like closure, proof that people could emerge from federal operations with their capacity for love intact. Jessica stood beside me as matron of honor, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, but her loyalty as fierce as ever. She'd been my anchor during the darkest periods of rebuilding, the friend who'd listened to endless analysis of Marcus's motivations without ever suggesting I was wasting my time on psychological archaeology. Agent Chen was there too, retired from federal service but still carrying herself with the quiet authority that had made her so effective at managing complex operations. She'd become something like a friend over the years, someone who understood the institutional pressures that had shaped our experience and could offer perspective on the human cost of national security work. "The rings, please," my mother said, and Marcus's best friend from graduate school stepped forward with the simple platinum bands we'd chosen together. Clean, honest circles of metal that symbolized the commitment we were making with full knowledge of our own capacity for both fidelity and failure. As Marcus slipped the ring onto my finger, I thought about the promise ring he'd given me 7 years earlier, the one I'd thrown into the Potomac River during my darkest moment of betrayal and rage. This ring felt different, not a promise of forever, but an acknowledgement of the work required to keep choosing love when easier options were always available. "I can't promise you forever," Marcus said, his gray eyes holding mine with the honesty we'd learned to value above romantic declarations. "I can't promise you I'll never doubt you again," I replied, the words we'd written together during months of preparation. "But I can promise you that I'll tell you when I'm afraid, and I'll give you the chance to prove that my trust isn't misplaced."
The ceremony concluded with a kiss that tasted like hope rather than desperation, like choice rather than compulsion. Our guests applauded, but the sound felt different from the overwhelming celebration that had marked my first wedding. Warmer, more genuine, free from the undercurrent of danger that had transformed romance into federal operation. 8 years later, the lecture hall was packed with undergraduates taking Introduction to Criminal Psychology, their laptops open and ready to capture whatever wisdom Dr. Sarah Reed might offer about the intersection of law enforcement and human behavior. I stood at the podium, looking out at faces that reminded me of my younger self, eager, idealistic, confident that justice was straightforward and love was uncomplicated. Today we're going to discuss the psychological impact of undercover operations, I began, clicking to the first slide of my presentation. Not just on the agents involved, but on the civilian populations who become unwitting participants in federal investigations. It had taken years to develop the academic framework for discussing my own experience, to transform personal trauma into educational content that might help the next generation understand the human cost of national security operations. The students didn't know they were learning from someone who'd lived through the phenomena I was describing, though some of them might have suspected based on the specificity of my examples. Marcus and I taught at different universities now. He at Georgia, specializing in therapeutic intervention for federal agents, while I'd accepted a position at Emory, developing curricula that examined the ethical implications of using civilians in law enforcement operations. We'd built separate professional identities that complemented rather than compromised each other,
learning to support each other's work without merging our careers into a single unit. Our marriage had survived the challenge of rebuilding trust, but it had also evolved in ways neither of us had expected. We'd learned to love consciously rather than passively, to communicate about needs and fears rather than assuming the other person could read our emotional states. We discovered that relationships built after betrayal required different skills than relationships built on initial innocence. Professor Reed, one of the students raised her hand, how do you think civilians should be protected when they become witnesses to federal crimes? What obligations do law enforcement agencies have to preserve their normal lives? It was the question I'd been hoping someone would ask, the issue that had driven my transition from corporate law to academic research. I'd spent the past decade studying the legal and ethical frameworks surrounding civilian protection, developing policy recommendations that might prevent other people from experiencing what I'd lived through. That's an excellent question, Michelle, I replied, recognizing the student from previous class discussions. Current federal guidelines prioritize operational success over individual privacy, but there's growing recognition that this approach may be both ethically problematic and practically counterproductive. After class, I walked across campus to my office, where a small stack of letters waited on my desk. Most were from former students, updating me on their careers in law enforcement or criminal justice. But one envelope, addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize, caught my attention. Inside was a letter from a woman named Jennifer Martinez, whose husband had been killed while working undercover for the DEA. She'd read my research about the psychological impact of federal operations on families, and she was writing to thank me for giving academic legitimacy to experiences that had previously been dismissed as collateral damage. Dr. Reed, her letter concluded, your work has helped me understand that what happened to my family wasn't just bad luck or operational necessity. It was the result of institutional choices that prioritize mission success over human welfare. Thank you for making this visible. I sat in my office holding Jennifer's letter and thinking about the strange path that had brought me from corporate law to academic research, from victim of federal operations to advocate for civilian protection. The woman who'd stood in a blood-stained wedding dress demanding answers had evolved into someone who could provide those answers for other people facing similar challenges. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Department meeting ran late. See you at home for dinner?
Home. After 10 years of conscious relationship building, the word still carried weight for both of us. We'd learned to create domestic rituals that felt authentic rather than performative, to build a shared life that honored both our individual growth and our commitment to each other. Looking forward to it, I texted back, meaning it completely. 12 years later, the congressional hearing room was intimidating by design, all dark wood paneling and formal portraits intended to emphasize the gravity of legislative deliberation. I sat at the witness table, a folder of prepared testimony in front of me, while C-SPAN cameras recorded what might become an important moment in the evolution of federal law enforcement policy. Dr. Reed, Senator Patricia Williams, addressed me from her position on the Senate Judiciary Committee. You've spent the past 15 years studying the impact of federal operations on civilian populations. In your expert opinion, what reforms are most urgently needed to protect the rights of people who become inadvertent witnesses to federal crimes? I'd been preparing for this moment for months, working with congressional staff to develop legislative language that would require informed consent before civilians could be used as operational assets, mandatory psychological support for anyone whose life was disrupted by federal investigations, and accountability mechanisms to ensure that operational success didn't come at the expense of individual civil liberties. Senator Williams, I replied, my voice carrying clearly through the formal chamber, current federal guidelines treat civilian witnesses as expendable resources rather than human beings with constitutional rights to privacy and autonomy. My research demonstrates that this approach not only causes unnecessary psychological trauma, but actually compromises operational effectiveness by creating hostile and uncooperative witnesses. Behind me, I could sense the presence of federal law enforcement officials who were probably not thrilled with my testimony. The FBI, DEA, and other agencies had fought these reforms for years,
arguing that operational flexibility was essential to national security. But a growing coalition of civil liberties advocates, congressional progressives, and academic researchers had created momentum for change. Could you elaborate on your recommendations for reform? Senator Williams continued. I opened my folder and began reading from testimony that Marcus and I had developed together, drawing on both academic research and personal experience to make the case for legal protections that might have prevented what happened to us. First, no civilian should be used as an operational asset without explicit informed consent, including full disclosure of potential risks to their safety and privacy. Second, any civilian whose life is disrupted by federal operations should receive comprehensive support services, including psychological counseling, legal representation, and financial compensation for damages. Third, federal agencies should be required to demonstrate that civilian involvement is absolutely necessary and that all other investigative approaches have been exhausted. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with senators from both parties questioning law enforcement officials, civil liberties advocates, and academic experts about the balance between national security and individual rights. It was exactly the kind of policy discussion I'd hoped to influence when I'd first started studying these issues, an opportunity to transform personal experience into systemic change. After the hearing, I walked out of the Capitol building into the late afternoon sunshine, feeling the weight of having spoken truth to power in the most formal possible setting. My phone was buzzing with messages from reporters, colleagues, and advocacy organizations, but I ignored them for the moment, needing to process what just happened. "How did it go?" Marcus's voice came through my phone as I answered his call. "I think we made progress," I replied, walking toward the metro station for my trip back to the airport. Senator Williams seemed genuinely interested in the reform package, and even some of the Republicans were asking substantive questions about implementation. "I'm proud of you," he said, and I could hear the genuine emotion in his voice. 15 years ago, you were demanding answers from federal agents in a ruined wedding dress. Today, you're testifying before Congress about policy reforms that could protect thousands of people.
It was a trajectory neither of us could have imagined when we were younger, when our biggest concerns were graduate school and weekend plans and whether our relationship would survive the transition from dating to living together. We'd learned that lives could be completely disrupted by forces beyond our control, but also that those disruptions could become the foundation for meaningful work. "I'll be home tomorrow evening," I said, already missing the domestic rhythms we'd built together. Morning coffee while reading the news, evening walks around our neighborhood, the kind of quiet intimacy that had taken years to reconstruct after federal operations had destroyed our early assumptions about trust and safety. "I'll make dinner," Marcus replied, "and we can celebrate your first congressional testimony." 15 years later. The book signing was held at a small, independent bookstore in downtown Savannah, the same city where I'd rebuilt my life after my wedding day disaster 20 years earlier. The memoir, Operation Nightingale, A Witness's Story, had been published 6 months ago to modest but meaningful reception. The kind of book that wouldn't make bestseller lists, but might change individual lives. I sat behind a small table stacked with copies, greeting readers who'd come to hear about my experience with federal operations and the long process of reclaiming agency over my own life. Many of them were women who'd survived their own encounters with institutional manipulation, people who understood the challenge of rebuilding identity after betrayal by systems they'd trusted. Dr. Reed, an elderly woman, approached my table with a copy of the book clutched in her hands. "I wanted to thank you for writing this. My son was an FBI agent, and reading your story helped me understand why he had such difficulty maintaining relationships after he retired." These conversations were why I had written the memoir, despite Marcus's initial concern that publicly discussing our experience might invite unwanted attention. The academic research had reached policymakers and law enforcement professionals, but the personal story could reach people who needed to understand that survival after institutional betrayal was possible. A young woman in her 20s approached the table, her nervous energy reminding me of my younger self. "Dr. Reed, I'm a law student, and I think I might be in a situation similar to what you experienced. There's this guy I've been dating, and some things about his life don't add up. I found your book because I was trying to understand if I'm being paranoid or if my instincts are telling me something important. I looked into her worried eyes and saw myself at 25, trusting and naive, about to have my world shattered by revelations I couldn't have imagined. But I also saw someone who was asking questions, who was listening to her instincts rather than dismissing them. Trust what you're feeling, I told her, signing her book with careful attention. If something feels wrong, investigate. Don't let anyone convince you that your concerns aren't valid. She nodded gratefully, clutching the book like a lifeline, and I hoped my story might help her avoid some of the pain Marcus and I had endured. As the evening wound down, I gathered my things and walked out into the warm Savannah air, past the same cafe where I'd once sat in exile, rebuilding my identity from scratch. The Spanish moss still draped the ancient oaks like curtains between past and present, but I no longer felt like I was hiding from my history.
My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. How was the signing? Good, I typed back. Meaningful conversations. Heading home now. Home was still in Georgia, a house we'd bought together 5 years earlier, with a garden where we grew tomatoes and herbs, and a study lined with books about psychology and law and the intersection of personal trauma and public policy. It was the kind of life we'd dreamed about during our early relationship, but better because it had been built consciously, with full knowledge of our capacity for both love and betrayal. As I drove through the darkening streets, I thought about the young law student and all the other people whose lives might be touched by federal operations they didn't understand. The work continued, the research, the advocacy, the slow process of changing systems that treated people as expendable resources. But tonight, I was going home to Marcus, to the man who'd learned to love authentically after years of professional deception, to the relationship we'd rebuilt from the ruins of Operation Nightingale. We'd survived the worst thing that could happen to two people in love, and we'd emerged with something stronger and more conscious than what we'd lost. The road ahead was clear, lit by streetlights and possibility, carrying me toward the life we'd chosen together, one honest day at a time.